Pardon me while I have a strange interlude.
For there is nothing else. Life is an obscure hobo bumming a ride on the omnibus of art.
Along the misty corridors of time, and in those corridors I see figures, strange figures.
Welcome back, my friends, to the AP Strange Show. I am your host, AP Strange. This is my show, and today's show is brought to you by the occult safety goggles for reading old dusty tomes. They not only protect your eyes from the dust that may come off of the tomes, they also protect your eyes from arcane magics that might affect them and cause you to see things that you can't unsee. So these safety goggles are indispensable to somebody that might be reading old, dusty, cursed tomes of forbidden occult lore. So that's a great sponsor for tonight, because you might need that if you end up checking out any of the volumes that we may be getting into tonight. Because with me tonight is the one and only Leah Prime. We have been kind of mutuals online and traveled in some of the same social circles for a long time, and she has always struck me as a well-rounded weirdo and the kind of person that I could talk to. But every time I feel like I look at a post she's made or talking to her just now before recording, I feel like I learned something new. So there are many layers to Leah, but she has a lot of firsthand experience with weird books and weird occult tomes, and librarianship with a lot of history around it. So very excited to get into this chat. We're going to be covering a lot of strange subjects. So welcome to the show, Leah. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, AP. Thank you so much for having me. And like I was saying before the show, I'm delighted for the chance to talk about rare books, especially like strange, weird, occult rare books. It was an area of academic focus for me for many years, and it's something that I pretty rarely get to talk about, especially with someone else who's kind of an advanced freak too, like someone else who's going to be interested in the weird stuff, instead of just like the pure academic side of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a thrill for me. I felt the same way. I'm like, hooray. Usually I'm just kind of sitting in my corner, like either reading about old weird books or finding sitting with some volume and reading it to myself and being like, I want to talk about this with somebody, but nobody I know has read it. So,
yes.
So yeah, it's good that we'll have this opportunity, and I hope readers or the listeners will enjoy and benefit from it. I think they will. So where did your interest in the arcane and occult books begin?
Yeah, so I actually have a lovely like superhero origin story. I did my undergraduate at this like super tiny engineering school in upstate New York. I was like highly technical in my educational background, and I completed school quite early and wound up on a fellowship at Universitat Karlova, Charles University in Prague, and I wound up living in Prague at the end of my undergraduate career. And I lived, two formative things happened. The first thing was I lived adjacent to the Strahov Monastery, which has one of the largest and most extensive collections of rare books and manuscripts in the world. It's right near the Prague Castle complex, Pražský hrad. And then I also, while I was there doing research, I was actually working at the Prague Geophysical Institute on like the social construction of science and astronomy. So totally not rare books and not engineering. But there was a very extensive rare book exhibit while I was there in Prague that I visited a number of times. And I was sort of in this position where I'd had this technical background. I had no interest particularly in actually being an engineer, right? Like I was sort of like, I was like the engineering version of like, I don't know, an English major, right? Where like you study
Mhm.
this thing and you come out and you're like, I don't really want to do this. And the discipline that I studied would have put me in one of like 6 locations in the United States. So it's not especially appealing. Um, but I spent a ton of time at the Strahav Monastery, notable because it has the best beer in the world. The Strahav Monastery Granat is like, I would buy a plane ticket just to drink more with the friars and monks at that monastery. Um, but I was exposed to rare books. I'd grown up in this like heavily book focused household. As I mentioned, like I grew up without television or movies, and instead had unfettered access to books. We always had money for books. That was the big focus of my parents, particularly my father. And I was really looking for what I was going to do next. And it occurred to me while I was there, I was very interested or started to become very interested in conservation and preservation. So, like, not books as academic objects, but books as like material objects. Um, which require typically you go through like an MFA program like this, and there's only a small handful of them in the United States. To learn, you study everything from organic chemistry because you're looking at like rates of decay associated with like vellum and leather bindings, to like how do you work with gold leaf, how do you rebind like rare artifacts. And it brought me to looking at graduate programs. And I had parents that when I came home from Europe were like, you need a plan and you need to move out. And so
Yeah.
I looked at graduate programs at Iowa University, the University of Texas at Austin, who I dodged a bullet there. They subsequently shut down their conservation program. And then I also looked at Indiana University, which is ultimately where I went to graduate school, because they had a joint master's program that allowed me to study rare books and manuscripts through their library school, now a School of Informatics and Computing. And then also a master's in Russian and Eastern European studies. So what my initial vision was that I was going to go through this program, do academic scholarship, and then ultimately try to actually return to the Czech Republic to work in like the National Library, or any of these like small archives in Central and Eastern Europe that, as my studies took me sort of in the direction, particularly of Judaica, like the history of Jewish publishing houses and Yiddish publishing houses. There's huge swaths of archives, both stateside and in Europe, that are basically leftover detritus from the war, that are always looking
Mhm.
for archivists who have some working functionality in these languages to help them understand what they have and get them either to who they actually belong to or to institutions of record that can like catalog and maintain these collections. And so I went to graduate school. I had the great privilege of working with Breon Mitchell and Joel Silver at the Lilly Library at Indiana. The no, Probably worth calling out is these really big state schools in the United States have extraordinary rare book collections, and they're typically inherited from whoever like the benefactor of the university was. So in Indiana, it's the Lilly family, like Eli
Mhm.
Lilly. And the Lilly Library had everything from, I mean, in my time there, I handled everything from Shakespeare First Folios to the Audubon book, which is like this gigantic book of James Audubon's drawings and illustrations of birds. They turn the page, 1 page a week at the Lilly
Right.
Library. So it takes like 6 years to get through. To a fully illuminated manuscript edition of Civitate Dei, the Canterbury Tales, I've handled and worked with Gutenberg Bible, which for those in the know, that's called a B42 because it has 42 line Bible.
Hmm.
And that was really my introduction. And what blew my mind as a student there was that, I was granted some degree of special privilege because I was in their rare books program. So I'd had the appropriate training for how to handle these kinds of artifacts. But because it's a public research institution, anyone can go in and petition to have access to the collections at this library. So if you're an independent scholar, you could go in and you could request access to anything. And like to me, that was always like a really powerful kind of testament to the value of these institutions, that they were freely accessible to independent scholars and that the work was done to make these materials like uh, safe and accessible to like anyone who wanted to come in and use them for research.
Yeah. I mean, that is pretty phenomenal. I don't think I realized that any
Mhm.
independent scholar can just No,
Yeah,
I
at public
imagine you have to have
institutions.
some. Yeah, I imagine you have to have somebody from special collections like actually handling it, especially with the rarer, older volumes like that. That you know,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yep. Yeah. And
yeah.
there's also, yeah, you usually will have like a research assistant. That was a lot of what I did when I was at the American Jewish Archives, is we would have scholars come in internationally, and like I would be the person in the I will correct, like, popularly people think you wear gloves when you work with this stuff. You never wear gloves. You just keep your hands clean, because your gloves, those white cotton gloves that you see in like movies when people handle manuscripts and stuff, they really affect like your tactile sensitivity. So you're much more likely to chip or bend or break a page working with them than you are working barehanded. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, it would be my job to basically be like, okay, like here's the foam cradle. We're going to delicately put this like 17th century codex in it, and you're not going to touch it, but I am. You're going to tell me where you want me to go in this book. Um, and yeah, I did a lot of that work at the AJA. I worked in special collections, and then I had a career that lasted for like 6 or 7 years in the rare book industry, or sort of rare book and special collections librarianship.
Wow. I mean, did you have a favorite that you personally handled of the books that?
You know, I there's a lot of things that when you it's sort of like that feeling if you've ever been to the Louvre and seen the Mona Lisa, like you come around the corner and you're like, oh, because it's small. It's
Yeah, it's
like eight
small.
and a half
Yeah,
by 11 and it's behind glass and there's a guard, and you're like, oh, that's it. Like I've seen pictures of this. So like there's definitely a lot of that sense um in rare books, where like you'll see a book and you'll be like, oh, that's what all the to do is about. Um Probably the thing that I saw that like really like when I saw it, I could not believe my eyes. Like what I was looking at was a copy of the Civitate Dei. Um, and it's like it's by Augustine of Hippo. It's basically this like treatise on Christianity. And the edition that we had was fully like a manuscript, so it was all handwritten, but fully illuminated, so pressed with all this gold leaf, and just impossibly beautiful and very big, right? Because
hmm.
vellum's quite thick. So like we're talking about, this book's probably about 6 or 8 inches thick. Um, and it was one of the few things, I mean, seeing a Shakespeare folio and handling one is pretty far out, because there's, only a few of them extant in the world. The same for the Gutenberg Bible. But I remember when I saw the Civitate Dei, it struck me, it was almost like a mystical experience, because it struck me that like
Yeah,
here's this like really formative text in Western civilization and Christendom, and it's right in front of me, and this probably took years and years to actually make. And you understand books as these like magical implements or mystical tools more than you do when you just like walk into a bookstore and see shelves and shelves of them. Like you understand for me, it was really a focusing of how rare these objects truly were, what astronomical displays of wealth these kinds of objects were, these codices. um, and just how powerful they were, that they're basically
mhm.
talismans or magical items, that in my sort of highly romanticized version of rare book librarianship, like I was always like, this is like we are like guardians of civilization, right? Like we're the ones who are sort
Yeah,
of
yeah,
maintaining and preserving through the vicissitudes of modernity, um, all of these artifacts from another time that betray a kind of craftsmanship and respect for intellectual tradition that, frankly, I mean, you don't see as much now. The rare books that you see now, um, like contemporary rare books, tend to be like first edition Stephen King books or signed copies of something that Faulkner wrote, right? So they tend to be just like a standard regular book that just happens to have something not nominatively special about it, versus working with the really old stuff, the codices and the incunabula books, where there's 4 or 5 of them in the world, and they've been preserved through 800 years or something.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, geez, now I have a couple of places I want to go, but
You can go anywhere.
you mentioned, well, because since you mentioned the Mona Lisa, I feel like that a lot of the notoriety from that painting comes from the fact that it was at one point stolen and then recovered, right? Wasn't there a whole
Hmm.
story with it that's part of the reason that it's such a well-known painting that and so iconic? Uh,
I I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I think I
Um,
had heard that somewhere, but I only bring it up because you had mentioned um, you had mentioned the concept of why some rare books reappear at some
Oh yeah.
points and then disappear again. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, this is one of those questions that um when I think like when I was everybody's rare book touch point, or when they had questions about stuff, every now and then you'll see these stories that show up in the BBC or the New York Times about how like, oh, like another copy of Shakespeare's Folio was found, or another copy of, Civitate Dei, or the Caxton text was found. And you're kind of left thinking, like, wow, how did Oxford not know that they had this in their collection? Or how did Trinity College not know that they had this? This is like an invaluable artifact. Um, and the reality is that even at the institution which I was at Indiana, there is when it would not be an understatement to say there is decades worth of cataloging and indexing to be done in their rare book collections, because the advent of using technological means to catalog and index a collection is relatively modern, right? It's only in maybe even, let's say, the past 45 years that you could have a computer database that captured not just what you had, but its condition, its provenance, any sort of bibliographic information associated with it. But the reality is that at these major institutions of record, if you look at Oxford, which has been around for centuries, um, they simply do not have the man hours to go through and actually catalog every single thing that they have. And when you're
Mhm.
talking about rare books and manuscripts, these are one-off items. So it's not as simple as just like scanning a barcode the way you would do in a typical library collection. You actually need someone to do some sort of like physical inspection of the item and understand what they have. And so what tends to happen is that you will have a researcher who will go into some random section of these libraries that maybe nobody has been in for a very long time, and they will unearth stuff that happened to have been misshelved or hidden, or taken away and then reshelved surreptitiously. And then it will come out that, oh, this was actually a first folio, or this was, a missing manuscript that we thought had been lost. Um, so this is something, where this has come up a lot, actually, which I'm somewhat ashamed to say, this point of view has come up a lot in ufology, when people claim
Mhm.
to find like old UFO photos, where they'll find them in an archive. And I'm like, of course they're going to find these in archives, because the idea that every archive at every institution is perfectly cataloged or searchable is preposterous. When
Right.
I was at Indiana, like we were looking at a backlog, I think, of like 22 years or something like that for our rare books. And so there's that. There's also, pursuant to what you were saying about the Mona Lisa, after the war, and I mean, this was actually a big thing when I was in Vienna, because there are a number of museums that, rather than having the original artwork, will have a black and white photograph or illustration of artwork, because during the war, so much art got plundered and moved around that there's stuff that has never been recovered. And it's either hidden in caves in the Alps. That's always like what you hear, that there's stuff hidden in the caves, or that these are works that, through perhaps questionable means, entered into private collections and subsequently never made their way back out into public institutions. And that's something, you hear about this a lot with art that was taken from Jewish families during the
Right.
Holocaust, but it's also something that you hear about, like, even just like books and artwork and artifacts going missing and winding up in private collections that, in the kind of murky underworld of artifact trading and selling, like that's where these deals are done. And there's no way to actually track or catalog where these artifacts live or who has possession of them.
Oh,
Um,
right. Because when people acquire them, they're not advertising it.
yeah, they're not talking about it. And like it's funny because like one of the things you do when you become a rare book librarian is you basically, it's not a literal oath of office, but you basically say you're not going to work in private rare book and manuscript sales because of the potential conflict of interest. But what what does wind up happening is, particularly, well, especially in the first part of the century. You don't really see institutions do this now, but I know at the Lily, to raise money, what they were doing is they were selling rare books on the private market to help fund the library's creation. The other thing that they were doing, which is like verboten now, is they were breaking books. So if you had like an incunabula of the Nuremberg Chronicle, they would break open these books and sell the leaves individually with certificates of authenticity. Um,
Mm.
to help raise money. And these are practices you don't see now. And in fact, you do see institutional efforts to either buy back stuff that they'd sold or to like try to recompose works that had been broken and sold as individual leaves. Um, but oh, this is what I was going to say is one of the classic experiences in rare book school, which I've heard happens at other institutions as well, is that there's a very famous auction where one of Shakespeare's first folios was being sold. On the private market. So it's like, I think it was at Sotheby's. And there's a proxy bidder there who's acting on behalf of some wealthy, some wealthy individual who's ready to drop $15 million on this item.
Mhm.
And the rumor is always that it's Paul Allen, the software billionaire who actually bought the
Yeah, yeah.
item. But watching this auction is one of those things that they kind of show you basically to be like, look, like institutions can't afford these items when they hit the private market. Like there's no universe where a public university is going to spend $15 million on something even as invaluable as something like a first folio is. And so keeping these things off the private market is sort of like a major, I would say, ethical philosophical underpinning of the entire profession, because you want to keep these centrally located institutions not only where they're accessible to academics, but also where independent scholars are able to use these items and research with them.
Yeah, because like you said, you're kind of a guardian of this knowledge and these artifacts, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it would be a travesty to have them like atomized and just wind up distributed in private collections. There's really great, and in my opinion, quite successful efforts to do cross-institutional sharings, which is quite powerful. So that, the Beinecke at Yale, which is they have the Voynich Manuscript. They're like the rare book library in the United States. Um, like their like rare books and manuscript libraries tend to have been at the forefront of like digitization efforts as well, basically to help both save trips for scholars who may want to work with the work, but also so that, different institutions, even if they don't have physical access to a materia, like they're able to pretty fluidly like share material between institutions. So, if I was at Indiana and I needed something at Michigan or at Yale, it was pretty easy to get like really high quality digitization and bibliographic information.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Voynich manuscript is at Yale, you say?
Yep, yeah, that's at Yale.
So theoretically, I could go there as an independent scholar and ask to see it.
So they are a private institution.
Oh,
So
that's true. Yeah.
they get to make different rules. Um, Although to be completely candid, it's one of those things where like if you were interested in seeing it, um, I'm not going to say I might know a guy, but I kind of might know a guy. And also, it's one of like if you are a good faith scholar and you reach out to a rare book librarian, or like someone at a research library like this, pretty often you're going to have success in being able to schedule like basically an independent viewing of it.
Okay.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. Like, I mean, at Indiana, we would get independent scholars all the time. But as a public institution, like they were really good about allowing independent scholars into to the reading room. If it was something especially rare, we'd have a librarian or research assistant work with them. But otherwise, they would just be kind of given like how to handle a rare artifact 101 in like 90 seconds, which is
Yeah.
basically like don't crack the spine, don't lay it flat on the table, like be very, very careful. You're not allowed to eat
Mhm.
or drink around it. And have access to all these materials, which I always think is like one of the great prides and strengths of the profession is sort of the democratization of access to these kinds of materials.
Yeah. I mean, that's excellent. Yeah. Because
Yeah, it's super cool.
it often feels like very inaccessible if you're not within academia to even know about a lot of these things. So yeah.
Exactly.
And I've always kind of wanted to go to Yale because I guess they have like a room that's full of brain specimens, like it's a brain collection. I've always
Cool.
kind of wanted to see that.
Have you been to the Motor Museum down in Philadelphia?
I have not. Last I heard, they had like closed for a while, and then they were. I'm not sure if they're reopened or not. I haven't looked
Yeah,
into it in a while, but I've
yeah,
always
and
kind of wanted to go. Yeah.
highly recommended field trip. I I would very carefully watch their job postings and fantasize about one day going to work someplace like that as like an archivist. Um, but yeah, that's if you want to see some brains in a jar, that would be probably my top recommendation.
Yeah. Well, good to know.
Yeah.
But okay, but speaking about human body parts and rare books, you were talking about anthropodermic bindings for books. Have you ever
Yes.
first have you worked with these personally, or did you just see them on exhibit?
So I have not worked with them personally. I have seen them as part of the Boston Athenaeum's collection, which is the Boston Athenaeum is a I would call it like a semi-private library. So like
Mhm.
if you live in Boston, you can visit it, you can even join it and I believe borrow things. But they have hosted collections of anthropodermic bindings, and it's one of those things that people are alternately super fascinated by and really disgusted by. Um, and they tend to be, for anyone, I mean, just to be super clear, these are books that are bound in human skin.
Yeah.
Um, and they tend to be either a lot of the works that I saw were either medical books, which makes sense, um, or criminal autobiographies or memoirs that were subsequently bound in the skin of the criminal, which
Hmm.
is very spooky and weird and extremely cool. Um, my
That seems
understand,
cursed.
yeah, that is like deeply cursed, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
touch one of those.
Right.
Um, but it's it's one of those things, not to get too graphic, but like the subject is always about that human skin does not actually tan the way that like cattle or pigskin does, and so it does not lend itself well to bindings because it's not super durable. But some of these anthropodermic books will have like some of the ones that like the criminal memoirs, what you would see tattoos in the skin, right? Which is pretty cool. And probably an aside, but notable, is Saint Bartholomew, who is the saint who was flayed alive, skinned alive, is also the patron saint of bookbinders. So
Huh.
yeah,
Oh,
that's a
I
nice
never
little
knew
bit
that.
of weird Catholic marginalia. Yeah.
Yeah, Catholic reliquary is such an interesting and gruesome thing.
Yes. Yeah. The statues of him like as like musculature, like holding his flayed skin.
Yeah.
And then it being the patron saint of bookbinders always struck me as just like so crudely funny.
Well, yeah, because I was going to ask you, you were talking about like preservation. How does one go about preserving anthropodermic texts? Is there like certain climates or conditions that or like what would you do to repair one?
Yeah, I to repair one, I guess you would find like a graft of something. Um, so yeah, so this is like what you're asking about a very particular kind of binding, but the answer really applies to any of these kinds of artifacts, which is that um, pretty much any rare book library is going to have just as a standard policy like humidity and temperature measurements and controls
Mhm.
within their building. The other thing that you'll see, and I encountered this a lot at a point in my career when I was working with either photographic negatives made out of acetate, which are highly unstable, or with works that may be rare but are not printed on any kind of quality paper is you will have vaults, and these vaults are typically they're exactly what you would expect. They're very dimly lit, they're super climate controlled, they're like basically hermetically sealed, and that tends to be where things like anthropodermic bindings or um, bindings either made of leather or with like vellum that may be in different states of decay or breakdown, or paper, right? Because most paper is highly acidic, which is why it turns yellow and brittle over time. And so you have to keep it in these super climate controlled vaults that typically like the big thing to know, or sort of an interesting thing to know, I guess, is that libraries, because of how books are packed, tend not to burn that well. So if there's a fire or something, because there's so little oxygen between each book on the shelf, they tend not to burn, especially in these kind of like controlled environments. So the real concern is not the fire itself, but subsequent water damage. And
Yeah.
like I know that at the National Library in Prague, when they had a flood in 2000, it might have been actually like the late 90s. Like the major portion of dealing with the aftermath was just like bringing in tons and tons of conservationists to work with water damaged works, because that's always the big concern. It's never really fire, because fire won't really catch that well in
Hmm.
a library as much as like the efforts to put out the fire, which leads to like some kind of interesting risk mitigation strategies around like having like nitrogen released into these rare book vaults to prevent fire spread rather than water. Um, and yeah, so just kind of an aside there. But
Yeah.
in terms, it's always comes down really to UV exposure and humidity. Like those are the two things. And when people ask me about like, how do you actually preserve things? The first thing you want to do is make sure your hands are always super clean anytime you touch something. You don't want to handle anything with cotton gloves, because that affects tactile sensitivity. And then you also want to store things in non-acidic archival quality, either sleeves or under museum glass, which offers some kind of UV protection. So I have a few leaves from the Nuremberg Chronicle. And then I also have a couple interesting woodcut prints from a 1493 publication of Froissart's Chronicles that I have framed and like displayed in my apartment. And they are under UV glass, museum quality glass, so that over time they don't fade and are not affected by exposure to sunlight or natural lighting.
Wow. Okay. So you have kind of one of those leaves that was sold off at one point to fund the museum, right?
Yes,
Or
I
yeah.
I have a wild story about this too. So when I was in grad school, so for anyone listening, you can go on eBay and just buy leaves from medieval manuscripts. You can also buy like, and when I say a leaf, I mean like a page. Or you can buy a page from an incunabula work. So Gutenberg Bible pages tend not to come up for sale very often in the public market. But if you manage to find one, you're talking probably around $10,000 for one page of a Gutenberg Bible. Um, but I have a hand watercolored woodblock print from the 1493 Nuremberg Chronicle. And it has pictures of all the philosophers, like these illustrated woodcuts. And I think I probably spent a few $100s on it. And it's big. It's probably like 18 inches by 24 inches. And then the Froissart's Chronicles, similarly incunabula, which means it was printed, not manuscript. That I have a print of a knight being beheaded, so a
Okay.
little bit weird and gruesome. Um, but my weird aside story here is my boyfriend in graduate school and he was a medieval scholar studying medieval illustration at University of Chicago, and we both were scrimping and saving our student pittance to be able to buy some of these manuscript leaves on the public market. And we got a phone call from the Indianapolis division of the FBI who wanted to talk to us about our collection at one point because there had been a massive theft at the Vatican. And a
Huh.
lot of the things that were stolen from the Vatican were making their way to the public market. And so the FBI was involved in this, trying to find like private buyers or institutions that may have been purchasing leaves or full codices or manuscripts from this sort of theft ring that was happening at the Vatican. And this was back in like sort of been like the early 2000s, like 2005, 2006.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. But obviously yours wasn't, right?
No, I did not have any hot goods. I just had weird woodcuts that, I thought were kind of interesting and wound up getting framed.
So the incunabula, that's such
Mhm.
a weird word to have to say. That would be kind of like early printing, that
Yes,
as opposed to like the Gutenberg press, right?
yeah, so so like the incunabula period, so it's I think the Latin meaning of incunabula is like from the cradle, right?
Right.
Like the sort of emergence of movable type printing press artifacts or books. Um we have the Gutenberg Bible, which was sort of the first movable type book widely available from from Johann Gutenberg.
Hmm.
Um, and the incunabula period is sort of seen as like the end of the 15th century to like the middle part of the 16th century. So from like
Okay.
1490-ish to about 1550, with the important note that like incunabula periods can be variable based on sort of their proximity to Germany. And I say that
Hmm.
because the area of my study was early Hebraic printing presses in Central Europe. So I was looking at Prague and Budapest and Krakow and Warsaw and Łódź. And incunabula in that sense would sometimes stretch as late as like 1600, just
Okay.
because the time it took to get movable press like built and distributed eastward was, took longer than what you were seeing in Central Europe at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess having to build it for different languages as well, with different
Exactly.
characters. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you get to the Hebrew presses and everything.
But
So, yeah.
one of just kind of an interesting aside is that Gutenberg himself, he was like a serial entrepreneur. And the printing houses or printing presses in the East had already adopted movable type printing presses. So like these were already established in the Far East. But Gutenberg himself had right before building the printing press, like the way he was making money, and this was just kind of an aside, is he was selling concave mirrors to pilgrims who were on pilgrimages, because the idea was that you could, and this is another one of these kind of interesting, totally not magical talismans in Catholicism, is you would, when you were on pilgrimage, you would bring these mirrors with you and try to reflect either a holy person like the Pope or a first or second degree relic, and thus capture like their mystical essence in this mirror so you could bring it back from pilgrimage. So that's sort of what sort of got him in the entre that like was what made him the money to be able to subsequently go on and actually start building a printing press.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Wow. So
crazy
these
stuff.
concave mirrors still exist, huh? Like there are there
Hmm.
examples in museums. I'd
Yeah.
never heard of this. This is like
Yep.
really interesting.
Yeah, they were like little pocket mirrors that he would sell to pilgrims. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so they felt like they captured some amount of holiness by catching the reflection in there. Yeah.
Exactly, like a third
Yeah.
degree relic or something, right? Where like
Yeah.
it was, because you couldn't get close enough to touch the Pope or have him touch a rosary. So what you could do instead was gather his holy reflection in your little mirror and then bring it back with you on your pilgrimage home.
Huh. But that's then you'd have a backwards pope though, because it would be
Yeah, well,
reversed.
you could use that for all sort of nefarious purposes.
I suppose so. Yeah. Um, all right. Well, with that, I mean, maybe we should talk about some of the more cursed objects and cursed books that we had discussed briefly prior to recording. Um, have you come across personally any books that were allegedly cursed?
Oh, I wish. You know, I mean, there are there are there are books that I have worked with that this is, it's not literally cursed, but like probably what I would characterize as sort of like the most kind of holy shit things that I've worked with in my career is actually a thing called a Yitzcore book. Um, and these were books that were made in the displaced persons camps after the war. And
Mhm.
what the Red Cross was doing is, because all of these towns in Central and Eastern Europe were just like razed to the ground, like they didn't exist after the war. And everybody who lived there would either be killed or there'd be like one or two surviving people. And so there's this huge collection of Yizkor books. Um, and they are typically in Yiddish, which is what brought me to working on some of them because for translation initiatives. And what the Red Cross would do in these displaced persons camps is they would basically interview people who were displaced from whatever shtetl they were living in like the Pale or in Ukraine or whatever, and then um, kind of collate the stories that they were told and use it to redraw like maps of these little towns and shtetls and like who lived where. And these were all based on like people who had survived the war, but they would say like, oh, Shlomo the butcher lived here, and this is where the synagogue was, and this is where, the grocery store or the market was. And use these as basically like ways in a pinch to kind of document the destruction of the war. And I bring them up. They're not exactly cursed, but I mean they're kind of cursed. But just in the sense of like the things that I've dealt with, like those always stand out to me as being like probably the most like emotionally powerful to work with. Just based on sort of their provenance and what they represented in terms of like recreating and trying to understand like after the war, the decimation, like what exactly was destroyed, because there are huge swaths of Central and Eastern Europe, like small towns that just did not exist after 1945. They were totally gone. And
Right.
there's still initiatives underway to translate these works. Like you can look them up online. Institutions will have them. I think Yivo in Lithuania, in Vilnius, has tons of them for translation work. But yeah, but we want to talk more about like witchy stuff or weird stuff
Yeah.
besides just like kind of cursed and sad. So yeah, so we talked a little bit about the Codex Gigas, right? The
Yeah.
Obji
Right.
Kniha, which is the Czech term for it, the Obji Kniha. And yeah, so the Codex Gigas, I think it's currently held in Sweden, which got it after the 30 Years' War, but it was originally from Czechia. And sort of the story behind it, it's first of all, it's notable because it is gigantic. It's like 170 pounds. It's like 2 feet by 3 feet. It's the largest known manuscript in the Western world. Um, and it is illustrated, so it has, it's manuscript, so it's handwritten, and then it has, historiated initials, so like these large, heavily illustrated initials at the starts of different books. It has the entire Latin Bible in it, so it's
Right.
already quite large. And then interspersed are texts of like different origins. So it has, I believe, like um, Josephus's works on the Jewish wars. It has the Chronicles of Bohemia, which is similar to the Nuremberg Chronicle. It's sort of this like comprehensive history of Czechia, Moravia, and Bohemia. It has a few books by Constantine the African, who is sort of attributed as bringing medical knowledge and history from what's now Tunisia up to Western Europe. But the notable thing, and the reason it is called the Devil's Bible, is because it has a gigantic full-page illustration of Satan, like right in the center of the book. And this
Right.
is notable partly because illustrating Satan is not something that you typically see in a Christian book like this. And on the opposite page, the devil or the Satan illustration is on the verso, the left page, and on the recto is a big illustration of the kingdom of heaven, right? So really
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting juxtaposition of these two illustrations. But there's this kind of apocryphal story about the Codex Gigas, which is that it was supposedly, the story goes that it was written by a monastic in the course of one night who was basically trying to absolve himself of sin in the eyes of the monastery, and that the actual length of the manuscript itself, it should take 20-30 years to actually write it. That's how large it is. And that in the course of this evening of writing the manuscript, he sold his soul to the devil in order to write the entire thing in the course of one night and produce this
Yeah.
manuscript in the next morning. And I believe it's typically attributed to like Herman the Recluse is sort of the monastic that they attributed it to. And it's probably worth noting that, generally the provenance of manuscripts like these, with some limited exception, is like our best guess. And that's partly because monastics or scribes were not signing their work generally. They were working in monasteries copying Holy Scripture. And the way you kind of ascertain where things come from is either through paleography, which is like the study of the actual script itself. So you have like majuscule and minuscule letters. You have Carolingian script, which is like of a particular time and place. So you look at the sort of the style or typeface that they're writing these manuscripts in. The other thing you look at as well is the chemical makeup of the ink itself. A lot of these inks are iron based, and so they'll oxidize over time. And different monasteries would have like basically, I mean, they're basically, I would call them like an alchemist almost, but like whoever's making up the ink, they would have different procedures for doing this. So the way you would determine like the extraction of some of these manuscripts is that, looking at the style of script, looking at how this iron-based ink ages over time and how that compares to works from different monasteries and different locations. And then you would also look, of course, at like the little grotesques or the little illustrations that
Hmm.
monastics would add in, because those were usually added in just kind of ad hoc, right? Like the monastic would just
Yeah.
like put little doodles in. And there are different monastics or different scribes who, would particularly draw like snails or draw rabbits. And you can trace the lineages of different manuscripts back to those particular creators. But
Yeah. I kind of
this
like the
is
ones that are like rabbits with weapons, like
oh
attacking
yeah,
people.
yeah. Dude, like what's super fascinating about these, I took a whole class with this fantastic academic, Rosemary McGurr at Indiana
Hmm.
University. She studies medieval illustration. And so I took this seminar class, this super tiny, on like the symbology of medieval illustration in these manuscripts and like what they meant, because they're telling stories, right? Like they're telling
Hmm.
stories in addition to what you're seeing in the text. And so like one of the common ones we would often reference is that like rabbits and hares that you would see in marginalia would be like they're usually like symbolic of virgins or women. And
Hmm.
so you frequently will see this sort of these illustrations of rabbits being pursued by dogs or by wolves. And sort of the underpinning of those illustrations is unsurprisingly like the sexual pursuit of virgins by men.
Yeah.
Um, and you see, similarly, like you see like unicorns in some of these scripts, which are both a medieval Christian symbol and also symbolize virginity and purity.
Hmm.
And yeah, snails, they're actually super common. You see them a lot like as knights, right? Like jousting with
Yeah.
each other and stuff. And they're usually like meant to represent like a sense of humility before God, right? Like that the knight on his horse is, in the eyes of the divine, is really just this like, you may as well just be riding a snail fighting with each other. It's this sort of very small, inconsequential thing in the scheme of the divine vision of the world.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome stuff. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just derailed what we were actually talking about. But so do you? I know the apocryphal story of Herman the Recluse. Do we have any like really better idea of the authorship of the Codex Gigas?
Yeah, so my understanding, and it may be Herman the Recluse, right? Like that, I think it's pretty well established that it's this particular monastic who wrote it. But the understanding is that the time it took to actually create it was in the order
Okay.
of decades. Like
Yeah.
we're talking minimum 20 years to actually create this manuscript. Um, and it over the course of its sort of lifetime has changed hands a number of times during war. That's why it's in
Mm.
Sweden right now, right? Even though it's of Czech provenance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I had read somewhere that you were talking about pages becoming yellowed because of UV light. That like
Hmm.
kind of the pages leading up to and leading away from the Satan illustration are all yellowed because that was the part people kept flipping to in
Yeah, of
those
course, it's
lights.
what people
Yeah.
actually want to see. Yeah, yeah. You have all these nice Christians, right, who want to read the Bible, but really just want to go gaze upon this giant
Well,
illustration of Satan.
yeah, it's generations of monks that are like, hey, you want to see something weird?
Yeah, you want to see something really weird? Like, yeah, we got a picture of the devil here. And it's interesting too, because like before we hopped on the call, I was like looking at the illustration from it of Satan, and like it's like, oh, it's so uniquely medieval, right? Like
Right.
this illustration of Satan is like not what you would think of Satan now at all. And it's not like
Hmm.
Doré's like highly romanticized version of Lucifer. It's this sort of like grotesque, like forked
almost
tongued,
cartoonish.
pot-bellied. Yeah, like
Yeah,
very cartoonish, very like primitive, right? He's wearing like a loincloth and is otherwise bare-chested. And has this kind of like serpentine countenance. It's very much like a grotesque in the sense that um it's deeply unpleasant to look at, and also like has there's no like romanticization of it where you see like a romanticized portrayal of Lucifer and like the Doré illustrations from Paradise Lost, or sort of how we think
yeah,
of the devil showing up now. Like this Satan is meant to evoke disgust and kind of repulsion and primitiveness, I think.
yeah. He's more like the Tasmanian devil.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Um, so yeah, that's in Sweden now.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's spoils of war, I suppose. But
Yes. Yeah, you're lugging home your 170-pound Satan manuscript. Pretty cool. I mean, when I was going down the rabbit hole on this codex, like what I thought was super fascinating, more than just the illustration of Satan and like its provenance, was like the inclusion of all these ancillary texts. So
mhm,
like it has this Latin Bible, but then it has Josephus's like Chronicles of the Jewish Wars, like these two chronicles, which is really fascinating. It also has a collection of like medical texts,
mhm,
which I mentioned, which were sort of theorized to be have been brought from like northern Africa over to Italy and then up through Western Europe. Um, and like the inclusion of the Bohemian Chronicle, which is somewhat similar to the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is like this. The Bohemian Chronicle was like commissioned and written by like this one businessman, and it's basically this tripart um history of Bohemia, Moravia, and Czechia. So like all the kings and the knights and the sort of national mythologies from the establishing of Prague and Slovakia all the way through, the Middle Ages. And
yeah,
I thought it was really interesting, the election to include those texts alongside a Bible,
hmm,
particularly like a full Latin Vulgate Bible,
yeah. Well,
because it's
I suppose the legend goes that he was supposed to, or the plan that Herman had was to write all the knowledge of the world in one book, right? So that's
yes, it's like
yeah. So
recreate Wikipedia in one night from his monk
right,
style.
yeah. I mean, were there some French texts that were kind of similar that kind of,
Mhm.
yeah, describe the whole history of France, but also had the Bible in them? And
Yeah, right.
yeah,
Like they're called chronicles, right? And
right.
they were very much kind of like status symbols to have in the medieval period, because like your family, if your family had enough money, they would buy one of these. Where you saw them really take off was in the incunabula period, right? Because like
Hmm.
that's with the emergence of the printing press, that's basically what democratized knowledge, or made literacy more of a common thing, because wealthy families could afford to buy, a couple books, and it would typically be they would buy a Bible and then they would buy a chronicle. And the most famous of these is the Nuremberg Chronicle, which I've mentioned a bunch of times, and that was published in I think 1493. It was originally published in Latin, and then there was like a Middle German publication of it. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's meant to be like a comprehensive history of the entire
Hmm.
world, like the summation of all of Western knowledge. And it's notable for a few reasons. One is they're gigantic compendiums. They're basically like having an encyclopedia. They're big books. I'd say the leaf that I have is probably at least 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide. So they're large. They'd be hardbound. Um, what would happen is you'd buy them kind of stock from a printing house, and then you would hire a bookbinder to put it together. So they'd bind it with wood, or wood and
Hmm.
vellum, or wood and leather, or whatever, and emboss it, maybe put your family's name on it. And then if you were really flush, you'd hire a third party, an artist, to go through and hand watercolor all the illustrations in it. So it's not like they were publishing colored pictures of like Aristotle in these works.
Hmm.
You would send them off, and then they'd get hand colored. And to be completely clear, the quality of the coloring of these works is highly variable, like version to version, right? Depending on who you
Yeah,
hired and like how good of a job they did. But like belief that I have is of the like Socratic philosophers, so like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and I have a German Vulgate version, so it's like the later, I think it came out in like 1493. And what's funny is, so they have like these woodcuts of the philosophers, and they're these all they all look the exact same. They're like wizened, they have like beards and like little hats,
Mm.
and they repeat them. So like the woodcut for like Aristotle is the exact same as like the woodcut for like Nostradamus or whoever, and they just kind of
Okay.
rotate through these random like like woodcut illustrations of who's actually, whose work they're talking about. Um, but yeah, these works, the Chronicle works, the Bohemian Chronicle is similar, right? Where it's this sort of comprehensive history of the land and of the town and sort of the Western Christendom and the Western intellectual tradition, quote unquote. They were meant to be super accessible. They were signs of wealth. Um, and they also really introduced like the act of secular reading into the general population.
Okay.
Which is, there's certainly substantial arguments to be made about the emergence of these, both in fostering the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, right, and the accessibility of scripture to the average person rather in the vernacular rather than through the vessel of a priest and Latin. Um, and also like just generally driving like conventional literacy rates among the lay people rather than just keeping literacy and book arts and reading strictly within the confines of the monastic environment.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And then naturally printing the Bible in languages other than Latin as well, so people could,
Yep.
yeah.
So you could actually read it, yeah, instead of just
Yeah.
listening to like a priest like perform Latin incantations over them like every now and then. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So so for English, that would be the King James was the
Mhm.
game changer in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a wonderful, though very long book that it's by Elizabeth Eisenstein. It's called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And it's
mhm.
sort of the seminal work, excuse me, that lays out like this sort of like broadcloth theory of how like the emergence of the printing press and the chronicles and these secular publications is sort of like effectively not only ushered in, like I mentioned, the Protestant Revolution, but also like making literacy an accessible thing for the average person rather than something that, was confined to the religious environment. And making the Bible accessible as well, right? Rather than just something
Yeah.
that was witnessed when attending Mass.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it helped people to have a greater understanding about the world too, and I
Hmm.
imagine help destabilize like monarchical structures over time.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like the democratization of knowledge that came with the printing press like to me the value like that to me is like the invention of humanity,
Yeah.
probably up there with like antibiotics and electricity.
Yeah. And I've always felt that like the occult and magic elements, especially in the old grimoires and the books and books as talismans too, is something that really has the ability to change the world, whether you believe in the workings or not. You know?
For sure. Yeah, look, right. And it like it introduces this kind of meta layer of, even if the book itself is not magical, like the perception and treatment of it may be so magical that it doesn't
Mhm.
actually matter, right? The enchantment of the item itself doesn't matter if it's treated and sort of revered as a particularly magical book.
Yeah. I mean, because like with over time, you had like the blue books and grimoires and stuff like that that were
Hmm.
hugely popular, and people just would buy those up, and there'd be a million different versions of them that would mutate over time.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, um, such an interesting history. Uh, well, are there any other? I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the Abramelin book, which is close to my heart because I had to read it again recently for a presentation I was doing. But
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And like so in studying like the history of printing and publishing in Central and Eastern Europe, like as I mentioned sort of in our chat before the show, what's really fascinating to me or was very fascinating to me when I was doing this research is that, I was studying Hebraic presses, so presses that were publishing Hebrew language texts. And
Hmm.
these texts in these publishing houses were overwhelmingly owned by Christians. And they were publishing primarily like Jewish mystical texts, so
Hmm.
Kabbalistic texts. Um, and there's this kind of, and I think this is a good segue into Abramelin, where there's this perception, particularly at that time in Western Christendom, of almost this like Orientalist view of the Hebrew text, right? That it's this sort of strange and arcane and definitively not Christian, right? Like the Abramelin
Hmm.
text is not a Christian text. Um, and it presented this completely alternative way of viewing. And I think that there's something sort of like part of me thinks it is like fetishistic, right? Like this idea of like, oh, it's in Hebrew, it's this like super mystical thing, and it's from the
Hmm.
Far East or from the middle, the but like part of me also is like this is really fascinating too because it's introducing in this almost like I don't want to say titillating fashion, but like in this kind of like really interesting way, like these alternative ways of seeing that people were not
Hmm.
being exposed to generally, right? And
Right.
Abramelin, was, I've sort of followed some of the discussion about whether it was actually a rabbi who wrote that text under his magical name. But I mean, that text I think was first translated and accessible to English speakers and readers in what, like the mid 19th century, late 19th century,
Yeah,
and then
late, like, yeah, S.L. McGregor
1890s,
Mathers.
1880s. Yeah.
Yeah, S.L. McGregor, S.L. McGregor Mathers translated it from a French manuscript,
Hmm.
and the French had been translated from the German, one
Right.
of the German versions. Yeah, but there was also a Hebrew version that was dated later than the original German. So it was written in German initially, at least the oldest copy that we can find.
Hmm.
So, right.
Yep. And it sounds like I recently read like 2 months ago, like I was reading the most recent translation that came out, and that's the authorship of it. The researcher um who just
George
did the most
Dunn.
recent, yes,
Yeah.
he is the one who sort of draws this conclusion that he thinks the author of um the Abramelin work was also a rabbi, and like
Yeah.
a Jewish man of stature in the Jewish community. I I don't know if I'm into that. Frankly, I don't know enough. But I think it's a really fascinating, if like interesting if true, as Josh Cutchin would say,
Yeah.
like interesting if true. Um,
Well, he makes a pretty good case for it. And he says, the authorship is generally considered Abraham.
mhm,
Um, uh, but that might have been a pseudonym, I guess, is what he's suggesting.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and you had
that,
mentioned how they'd gone back and taken the original German and republished it in Hebrew, right? To sort of
yeah,
add this mystique to it, which is really
right.
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Ibis Press version is written in a very readable modern English, which is
Yes.
different from the Mathers one, where he tries to do more of like a Middle English, like poetic kind of
Yes.
version of English. Yeah.
And it's fascinating because it's so applied, right? Like when you read it, like part of it is this like epistolary text, like where
Hmm.
he is just kind of recounting, his life. But in reading the actual workings that are documented there, it's like I was like, oh, it's a cookbook, right? Like he's telling you exactly what you need and what you do and how you do it and where you do it. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's really compelling. And also just the kind of mythos that has sprung up around the work in modernity,
Hmm.
where it is highly regarded, as sort of a primary Western occult or hermetic text, magical text, but also, oh, you're not supposed to read it. It's cursed. You're not supposed to handle it. There's all these sort of like legends and myths
Yeah.
around the power of it, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I think that speaks to in what you were saying earlier, where there was an almost a fetishization or an Orientalist fascination with like Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, which I think forms a lot of the bedrock for like modern Western hermetic and magical ritual and organizations, where it just seemed like they were just kind of I always had a difficulty with high ritual magic and reading about it because it seemed like things were just getting skimmed from Jewish texts and given like a Christian hermetic stamp. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
was
Yes.
like, I'm not sure I'm into that. Like,
Yes. It's yeah, there like it's really fascinating to like oh oh man, I have so much to say about this. Like the first two is that this kind of like arcane fascination with like with like Hebrew or Jewish practice is like a mystical thing
yeah,
against the larger backdrop of sort of like just not contemporary but like contemporary at the time anti-Semitism is really fascinating, right? It's like this
yeah,
idea
right.
of
That's
like
what I always
you're
blew my
engaging with
mind.
this
It's
like
like,
forbidden text.
yeah, it was almost like the taboo of
Exactly.
it, even within themselves. There probably people were probably conflicted because I always just, even if you don't know for sure, just the culture informs people, and you know that the anti-Semitism was huge at the time. So it's like
Yes.
these early modern magical practitioners must have had that in them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and exactly. I think taboo is a great word for it. And like it's very funny because my perception, like, and I'm coming from a Jewish background, right? And like I grew up
Hmm.
highly observant, and now super secular and occult and weird. Um, is like when I read the Western esoteric works now, I'm struck one by how they pilfer from Judaism for sure,
Hmm.
and Kabbalah, but also like how in like again coming from a personal practice that is deeply rooted in like Buddhist and Vedic Dharma work, like how much they also so clearly pilfer from those traditions and kind of
Yeah.
repackage them into being palatable to sort of like the Western Christian framework of reality.
Hmm.
Whether it's meditation practices, like it's very like they're not bringing over the language, right? They're not bringing over the words dharma or karma or samsara, but they're taking a lot of these methodologies and sort of redacting them through this filter of Western Christendom to make them weird enough to be interesting, but like not so arcane that and not so rooted in their original language that they could be construed as anti-Christian.
Yeah. 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 Because I mean, I feel like a lot of um I feel like I was disappointed looking into a lot of Western esotericism to see
Yes.
how Christian it is really on its face. Like they tie a lot of it to Rosicrucian
Hmm.
lineage that's largely apocryphal, but or
Yes.
mythical, but
It's
so they try to kind of claim it for Christianity, even though it's an occult kind of mystical sort of thing within Western Hermetic tradition. But yeah, they're really just kind of stealing from other religion, other world religions without really copying to it,
yes. Yeah, and they're also like, and this is something, when I'm like reading Eliphas Levi, right?
Yeah.
And like I'm like, wow, if I were coming from a Christian background, I would be like, whoa, this is like really like groundbreaking or very like,
Mhm.
different from anything I'd ever done. But like as someone who is not Christian, who does not have a Christian background, like a lot of the works always strike me as very like reactionary to
Mhm.
Christianity too, in ways that like I don't relate to my practice and like I can't relate to like intellectually or spiritually. They seem very like no, you shut up, dad kind of stuff, where it's like it's just pushing back against the prevailing kind of Christian paradigm in ways that are subversive and taboo, but that like if you're not Christian, they're not going to resonate with you in those ways.
Right. Yeah, the pearl clutching triggers aren't there.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm like, oh yeah, yeah. But I mean, I look, I had a very brief fascination with Roman Catholicism in my 20s. And I remember the first time I went to mass, I was like, oh, this is just like synagogue. Like it's structured the same way. They use a lot of the same words. Like it's almost the exact same thing, with the exception of, taking communion and, talking about Christ a lot. But like the
Right.
same, it's the same kind of formulary and the same kind of, I mean, even a lot of the prayers are super similar. It's very familiar. It was just also deeply alien at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up Catholic. I still like a mass once in a while.
Oh yeah. Yeah, masses are magical rituals, right?
They are. Yeah.
Like they're magical rituals. Catholicism, like I have a very soft spot for it, particularly like the intercession of saints and the rituals and their magical workings, right? Like praying the rosary is a magical working.
Yeah.
Attending a mass is a magical working, and whether it's I've attended Gnostic masses at OTO temples. I've attended ceremonies at all different kinds of practices, and it, my takeaway from the mass experience is that this is a magical working, right? Like it's very powerful and it unifies people and their consciousness in one particular direction. It's meant to shape reality in a particular way. It's meant to shape behaviors in a particular way. The intercession of saints is, or the petitioning of saints is very much like, in my layperson's opinion, very much like a pantheistic model in many respects.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like a soft pantheism.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, right. Like you pick the saint that like resonates most with you and you root for them, just like you would root for Apollo or Athena.
Yeah. It's also similar to like Gnostic ideas where you have all the tons of different angels and things like that, you know?
Hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why, I've never really lost my roots with Catholicism. I've pushed back or like walked away from it before, but it's always kind of there.
Hmm.
Like I have a big crucifix right above your head behind the computer right now.
Incredible.
So
Yes. I feel
so
blessed.
yeah. Um yeah. And so um I guess in a lot of ways, whether a text is cursed really depends on your point of view too.
Hmm. Right. Exactly. And like I mean, I think of the seduction of the taboo or the seduction of subversion powers a
Right.
lot of this, right? Like, I mean, it and you know, it's pure anecdote, but in my own practice, right? Like I was drawn to the esoteric and occult in sort of its subversion to popular culture and sort of popular belief systems and behaviors. And I think almost everyone I know who's a practitioner entered probably through similar pathways, right? Like they were
Mhm.
very interested in sort of exposure to ideas that were maybe less common, or to the idea, which I mean ultimately is deeply Protestant or Chabad in nature, which is that like you can have an individual encounter with the divine that does not need to be intermediated by a third party. And like to me, that when I think about like the esoteric and occult traditions, like that to me is a hallmark of them. This
Mhm.
idea that like this can be an individuated experience that can be mediated through one's own reality without being pinned against either the prevailing authorities or reality of a third party. So you don't need a priest acting as your intercessionary. You can engage directly with these actions. Um, and I
Yeah.
mean, the question of whether it works or not is, largely a matter of personal opinion.
Yeah. Or where you choose to place your faith.
Exactly.
And growing up, to me, I always felt a much more spiritual experience when I was just tromping around in the woods with my dog or by
Yes.
myself than I did being forced to go to church. And it's like later I read about Saint Francis of Assisi, and I'm like, oh,
Hmm.
these things don't need to be separate.
Yes. Exactly. This is exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you can have a the spiritual world is not limited to the walls of a church or a synagogue. And I think, very candidly speaking, I think that's one of the main failings of sort of contemporary organized religion, is that it treats it as like this siloed experience, when the reality is that the world itself is, like life itself is a religious practice, and that, the mystical is all around us. And
Yeah.
similarly, find a lot of spiritual resonance and encounters with the mystical or the numinous to be found in nature. For me, that's always been my experience as well. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, Saint Francis of Assisi is sort of a hallmark of that, right?
Yeah.
I used to take my cats to get blessed on his saint's day, uh,
Nice.
at the local diocese.
I have a statue of him under my cherry tree outside where the birds all like to hang out. So, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful
Yeah.
offering.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah, so you want to talk a little bit more about a few other books that I was going to mention or bring up
Sure.
while we're
Yeah.
we're
Wait.
chatting
Yeah.
away? So the first one is the hip. I always struggle with the title on this because it's a big, long Latin word, but it's the Hypnerotomachia polyphily, and this is actually, I first encountered this when I read, there's this fiction book, which probably came out around the same time as the Da Vinci Code, that called The Rule of Four. And it
Mhm.
was a rare book, mystery thriller book. And it specifically is talking about the polyphily. And that's another one of these kind of strange or like dreamlike works that were published during the incunabula. I think it was published around like 1500, late 1490s. Came out of Italy. And it's this very like dreamlike work. Like it's not religious. It's I would call it maybe like a mystical work, because it's really like an exploration of like art and architecture. It's extremely like it's very flowery in how it's written. It's a challenging work to read. And it's sort of meant like, I mean, while we're talking about books as magical objects or as artifacts, like this to me stands out as one of, it is not a literal magical work. Like there's not, ceremonial magic detailed inside. It's not a grimoire, but it is one of those works that when you read it, it is meant like, I would call it a psychoactive text, right? Like this kind of immersive, um, kind of miasmic prose that requires a substantial amount of attention, and care with reading it to really glean what's going on. It has a lot of like experimental language in it.
Mhm.
And it also similarly has lots and lots of woodcuts. It's generally regarded, I think, as like one of the finest examples of like woodcut art, that were used in these early incunabula presses. And I think it has like almost 200 of these in the text itself. There's a
Mhm.
beautiful re-edition of it that you can buy, at your favorite bookseller. Um, but it's really fascinating. It's basically like this aesthetic work that's about like love and art and beauty and nature. It's I would not call it distinctly pagan, but it's also definitely not really Christian either. Um,
Mhm.
and I bring it up because I think of that as very much like an occult or haunted book or something like that, just by the nature of its contents and sort of the experience that you have when you're reading it.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like I'm having an experience just having it described to me.
Yeah, it's
It
it's
seems
it's
like
really
almost
magical.
it seems like almost like a literary equivalent of watching like a more surreal scene in like a David Lynch movie or something.
Exactly. Yeah, like it's so unmoored from reality that like it in and of itself is like a psychoactive experience to read it and flip through it. Um, and I think, I mean, what it kind of reminds me of is that contemporary Codex Seraphimus, I think is what it's
Yeah, yeah.
called. Yeah, it sort of reminds me of that. And this kind of it's not exactly like
Seraphianus, I think.
Serafianus. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not like exactly like one-to-one parody, but like that same kind of like surreal, strange, like just like spending time intensely focused on that book is like an expansive experience.
Huh. Yeah, because I mean, the guy that made the Codex Seraphianus is still around, I think.
Oh
Um,
yeah, he's alive and well.
and he's pretty steadfast in saying that there's no mystical meanings to it. It's just cool stuff he drew.
I mean, yes, but he may
Right.
not intend it that way, right? Like this is always the
Yeah.
question of authorship and its, the intended audience and how the audience actually receives the work. Um,
Yeah, and how
but
much you control the artist even has over that. Like, even if you don't intend it, doesn't necessarily mean it's not spooky and mystical.
exactly, like as far as I'm concerned, he is just a vessel for the divine, and he may not have anything to do with the actual mystical output. He's just the one
Yeah,
who's drafting it on the page, and who knows like what being or force is working through him to manifest those works in a way that everyone can experience them and enjoy them.
yeah. Well, I mean, I've always kind of compared that one to the Voynich manuscript as
Hmm.
uh, heavily illustrated. Do you have, so we brought that up earlier, but kind of moved right past it. Do you have any thoughts on what that book means, the Voynich
Yeah,
manuscript?
that's a great question. It's one of those things. Oh gosh, I have so many thoughts on it. The first is that, one of the perennial conversations I've heard since I entered this field, like eons ago now, like 20 years ago, is that, oh, with the advent of like AI or with computers or like linguistic software, like we're going to be able to figure out exactly what it says, right?
Right.
Which is interesting, but seems to never quite come to fruition.
Mm.
Um, what I think is really compelling about it is that the language, I mean, you put air quotes around that, right? Because it's just this like script of
Hmm.
unknown provenance and authorship. What's really fascinating to me is that the language used in it obeys natural language like frequencies like Zipf's law, like it does betray like some kind of language or some kind of natural language and
Hmm.
the frequency of characters and how things are structured. So even if we don't know what it says, just the typography of it or the actual writing of it indicates that there is likely probably some kind of natural language behind it, which is really fascinating. um what I think is probably most likely, if I like just like knowing what I know about it and sort of, you know, this isn't at best a moderately educated guess, is that it feels to me like something that was drafted um, by somebody who was literate, but was using their own TypeScript to write what
Hmm.
they were thinking and observing. And similar to like how if you keep a handwritten journal, you may use like some kind of cipher to replace
Yeah.
different letters. I don't think it's quite that simple because I think if it were, we'd have been able to crack it and figure it out.
Well,
But
it kind of reminds me of like shorthand when you see the people taking notes in
exactly.
shorthand. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I do think there's something there. I don't think it's like a pure art book. I don't think it's like just some abstract. I don't think it's like a mentaculus from somebody who had schizophrenia or anything. I think it's
Yeah.
probably betrays some kind of natural language. There is, every now and then I go down the rabbit hole because every now and then somebody will come forward and say, oh, they've solved it or they figured it out or have
Hmm.
translated it. My understanding is that none of these really are legitimate conclusions or translations, but this is not a rabbit hole I've gone down in the last, I'd say, 5 years.
I feel like there's a news story at least once a year.
Right.
I joke with Tim Banal about this. It's like, is it Voynich manuscript season yet? I think it
Yes.
might be coming up
Yeah, it's
actually.
it's slow season and we gotta put something weird and yeah, and like some like armchair cryptographer decided he figured out how to do it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I will cop to I do have like the solution or translation to it from Amazon sitting in my Amazon cart, and I've never bought it. And
Okay.
I probably should just pull the trigger and buy it just to be like, what is this person actually trying to say? And like, what are they assessing about this manuscript? But
Yeah, there have been interesting ideas, but I don't think
mhm,
anybody's definitively cracked the
yeah,
case. Yeah.
no, it hasn't. Do you, I think the other thing that's fascinating about it too is the quality of illustration.
Yeah.
It's very clear that its provenance is from somebody who was educated, fairly worldly, like exposed to lots of different things, likely quite literate. Um, but otherwise, like beyond that, it's pure conjecture. Do you have any theories about it?
I do not really. I mean, but I do feel like a lot of the illustrations to me look like plants. Like they have a very
Hmm.
kind of like botanical kind of appearance. So,
Yes.
so I mean, I think that might be the biggest clue is some kind of naturalist, like I don't know, maybe envisioning envisioning plants that they wanted to create or something, if they were going to try to breed for that, or like
Hmm.
yeah, cultivate plants that imagining plants that they could cultivate eventually through cross pollination and things.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm with you. That's true. A lot of the illustrations are botanical. And yeah, I mean it could just be like a biological text, you know,
Right. I mean,
like you're saying.
yeah, and I mean, people have had that theory before too, that it had something herbalistic about it, that they were supposed to represent herbal
Hmm.
remedies and things like that. But yeah, I've never really known what to make of it, and it has been a while since I've really looked through it. But I do feel like it's one of those perennial things that just keeps coming back. But my sense of it has always been there's something botanical about it or herbal that's
Yes.
very important to figuring it out. That's about all I can come up with.
Hmm.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you didn't think it was the result of somebody kind of like schizophrenic inventing their own language. Are there examples of that? Like somebody just kind of writing essentially gobbledygook that made sense to them while they were writing it?
I can't believe I'm going to admit to this in a public forum, but every now and then, in some of the more occult-minded subreddits, you'll get somebody who posts like their grimoire, right? And it's
Okay.
like lots of sacred geometry and lots of scribbling and lots of somebody who is, depending on the way of looking, is either going through what we would pathologize as some sort of psychotic episode, right? Like break with reality, or they're going through like a deep awakening experience and they're manifesting it as hypergraphia, right? They're just obsessively writing about it and drawing pictures and stuff. Um,
Okay.
but I think that that's, you know, I don't, there's a great museum in Baltimore, the American Visionary Art Museum. And I bring this up because one, it's probably my favorite museum in the country. It's amazing. It's an art museum that is specifically tailored to art that is like outsider art. Like
Hmm.
they had a like I the last time I was there, they had a big collection of Ingo Swann's paintings and like talking
Oh,
about like
amazing.
telepathy and like mass consciousness and stuff. So it tends to be like art and materia that are created by people that are not classically trained artists, right? Like I also like they had like a fashion exhibit of these like incredibly ornate sequined gowns that were made by like just this like seamstress who just was like seized by the creative act, the creative
Hmm.
drive to make them. But one of the things that was on exhibit when I was there was also collections like we're talking about, like collections of people that were undergoing some kind of awakening and were keeping notebooks or drawings or writings about it. And you could, they had the notebooks like broken open and framed, so you could walk through the gallery and look at them. They're really fascinating stuff. And like, it's always struck me, and this is part of how I reconcile being a Wagnerite with being Jewish, because we all contain multitudes, but also this idea that creativity is the creative act itself is like that the artist or the creator is just very much a vessel for it, and who they are is a distinct and separate thing from the creation. Um, and it's hard not to be struck when you see the works of these people who are not classically trained artists who create these magnificent works, that like it's hard not to get the sense that they are acting as basically like vessels for the numinous or for the divine, right? That they're
Yeah.
basically just these manifestors who make real in our physical reality, um, what is actually going on behind us and above us and beyond us.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, maybe the maybe the Voynich manuscript is that. It's just something. It's a glimpse into a reality that is not quite. It's just kind of on the periphery of our reality, our
Yeah, it's
shared
on the
culture.
edge.
Yeah, that it can be perceived under the right circumstances, and this one guy tried to catalog it.
Yes. Yeah, it's also, I mean, I think this is something that in I'm trying to think of how to formulate this. Like one of the more powerful practices that I have found in my own spiritual workings, right? Like in my pursuit of like Shaivism and Buddhism, like is that our language is so poor for talking about the internal experience and like
Hmm.
the expansion of consciousness. And I mean, you see this, I mean, probably the most quotidian way you see this is people trying to describe like psychedelic experiences, right? Like, how do you even
Hmm.
begin to describe these experiences? Um, and like one of the more powerful results of like working with a teacher or working in a sangha or community setting when you're in deep meditation or doing these kind of like more arcane practices is creating a shared vernacular to be able to talk about these experiences so that you're all kind of pointing in the same direction when you talk about one particular practice or one particular experience or phenomena that arises when you're either practicing magic or sitting in meditation. Because otherwise, I mean, the word ineffable is doing a lot of lifting, but like, otherwise, these experiences are not experiences that we're typically able to wrap language around in a way that conveys them consistently to other humans. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah,
the
so I
language is
mean,
inadequate.
language is inadequate, and this
Yeah.
is one of those like areas that I personally have changed my mind about substantially over the last 10 years, right? I used to always think like language was enough, like I was much more of a rationalist.
Hmm.
Um, and now much more fully understand that so much of experience, particularly like numinous experience, practice experience, exists far beyond the confines of language, and that to even begin attempting to communicate it in a way that is legible to others is like very much a skill and an art.
Yeah, and that's why books are super important.
Exactly. Yeah, books create a Rosetta Stone, right? Like they
Yeah.
create a Rosetta Stone that we can all read and share and have a shared language and shared experience around. And I mean, books are psychoactive technology, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, they're
like
time machines. They're
yeah,
and yeah, there are a lot of different devices all in one, but they're also mystical portals.
yes. Every
they
book is a
unlock
portal.
they unlock various doorways in your mind. Open
Hmm.
avenues and vistas for looking at things that you never would have considered, and you never know when it's going to hit you. It doesn't have to be
Exactly.
some mystical book. It doesn't have to be,
Dude,
old.
I
You know.
no, it doesn't. And like this idea of like I don't know, like psychoactive literature is really compelling to me. I read Moby Dick for the first time last year. Um
Oh man, you're speaking my
and
language. Yeah.
but yeah, like Moby, like every other page I was like, this is a mystical text. Like this is a mystical work. Like it's like barely even a fucking book, right? Like it's just like this conglomeration of observation and
Yeah. Yeah.
whale biology. Um but like I remember, I mean, the classics are classics for a reason, but also I remember being so struck by like how expansive I found the prose at different points and just sort of
It's
how
it's gorgeous, and
it's transcendent. Yeah.
it captures things about reality and the human condition and the experiential spiritual qualities of even the most mundane things to the grandest things in a
Yes.
way that language rarely captures. Like Melville really was. And I mean, I think you have to be at the right place in your life to read it too. I think there's a
Yes.
moment for each person where they can approach Moby Dick and be absolutely floored.
Yes. Yeah, that was me. Yeah, that was me
that,
last year. And
that was
and
me about 10 years ago. It just, that was where I finally, because I had this secret shame around Moby Dick. I chose to read it for a book report in high school and could not
uh
get into it because high school was not the time to read
I
that.
can't imagine reading something like that in high school, right?
You
I
need
was
to
busy
live
reading.
life a little bit.
Yeah, I was sneaking out to see boys and reading Robert Anton Wilson. I wasn't reading Moby Dick.
Well, the books I read when I was in high school. I mean, I grew up with a lot of the uh, like 19th century stuff, like Jules Verne
Oh
and
yeah,
Poe and Twain, and like that was kind of my jam. So like Melville wasn't like a far leap for me, but
sure.
I think looking at it from Ishmael's viewpoint, you can't really do that as a teenager because he's talking about having drifted through life for a while and just being kind of listless.
Hmm. Yep.
And you can't really understand that.
Yeah, when you're like 16. Yeah.
But 10 years ago, me definitely
Yep.
could.
Yep. Big same. Big
It's
same. Yeah.
yeah, like time to jump on a boat and travel the world because what
Yeah.
else am I doing?
Travel. Yeah. There's this paragraph where he talks about like the hypnosis that comes with sitting in the crow's nest and looking out across the waters. And I
Yeah,
remember reading that and being like, this is easily this is a mystical text, like this is giving
yeah,
me, like, for me, the sort of the litmus test is sort of the embodied response to these readings, like what does it feel like in my body when I read these kinds of works. And I can remember being like deeply set off by portions of that book as like, whoa, this is like reading the Bhagavad Gita for the first time, where it's this like really expansive, incredible work. um have you read, out of curiosity, because I hype and harp on this freaking book all the time, have you read Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay?
I have not, but I think I have it around here somewhere.
That's a really good, weird book.
Okay.
Yeah, I mention it because you're talking about Jules Verne, and I think of it as sort of like the proto science fiction novel. Like it starts at a séance and winds up with the main character jumping on a rocket, and this is before rockets were like even a thing, right? Like this is like turn of the
Mhm.
century. Um, and it lands him on this like strange alien planet. It's like there's a lot of like weird queer stuff going on where like the people on the planet change genders and take all these different kinds of lovers. And it's sort of it's I would call it like a deeply Gnostic novel, deeply strange. There's a beautiful
Hmm.
illustrated edition of it that just got published, I think about a year ago. Um, and it's another one of those works that, I don't know, I come back to it all the time as like this, just this example of very strange future looking literature that was very out of time when it was published, but now I think is not it's just it's a really fascinating work. Harold Bloom, noted creator, proponent of the Western canon, actually wrote like what I would call like a glorified fan fiction sequel to it, and
Okay.
then worked really hard to get it pulled from the shelves because he was so ashamed of it later
No.
in life. But you can still find copies of it, but you have to like find it on like 8 books or whatever if you want a copy.
Yeah. One of the more modern rare books.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, that is the funny thing is that some books, like in the modern day, become rare just because of weird political reasons or because
Mhm.
because disputes with publishers or the author didn't want it out there. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, and like the other thing is it's stuff like that. And then it's the other thing, I worked very briefly for like one semester with a curator of modern rare books. Um
mhm.
and it's as I mentioned, like a modern rare book tends to be like a first edition Stephen King or Harry Potter that is in very good condition that may be signed by the author. But the other universe of contemporary rare books are art books. So these are books that, are created by artists that typically have publication runs of like, 50 to 500 and wind up in either private collectors' hands or at like rare libraries. And they're really fascinating areas of exploration. Um,
Mhm.
I can distinctly remember, it's driving me nuts because I can't think of the artists themselves, but like this very ornate book on like collage work, looking at it
Okay.
and being like, oh, it's one of like 70 copies that were printed, and the Lilly Library at Indiana bought a copy, and is going to, hang on to it because there's so few. Um,
Huh.
One of the other rare books, and this is like a total lane change, but I think it's worth noting. Hey, are you familiar with the Book of Record?
It sounds familiar.
So, the Book of Record was a book that was published in very limited supply in 1939, and it coincided with the placement of the Westinghouse Cupola time capsule in Sunken Meadows, New Jersey. So in 1939, Westinghouse created this um, this alloy of metal. It's like copper or steel alloy. It's supposed to be like, it doesn't like rust or break down or anything. And at the World's Fair in 1939, they buried a time capsule with the idea that it would be open in 5,000 years. So like amazing marketing stunt, right? Like you're burying
Hmm.
this like tube of metal. But alongside it, and what I have always found really, really fascinating is they also wrote something called the Book of Record. And I think they published like 500 copies and they placed it at institutions of record around the world. So it's at like the Library of Congress, it's at the Vatican, it's at Harvard. Um, it's probably about 100 pages, and it is this multi-part work that details not only where the time capsule is, right? Like where it's located, how to find it, what's inside of it. It has kind of a little exegesis on like the triumphs of modern humanity and like look at our cool metal alloys and like polyester stockings and radio and stuff. But then it also contains a whole lot of like linguistic and philological information about like how modern English is spoken. So there's all these kind of like anatomical cross sections of like the mouth and the tongue for how you say different things. And the idea is that that by placing these books at these institutions, the faith is put in these institutions that they will continue persisting over the duration of this time capsule. So that even if you forget about the time capsule, that like at some point somebody's going to unearth one of these books of record at one of these institutions and either try to find the time capsule or at least have this kind of self-selected anthology of what life was like in America in 1939. You can check out a copy. I think like the Internet Archive has a copy. It's
Okay.
definitely worth your time to check out because I think it's really fascinating both for what it documents and then also this sort of meta layer of what it says about the optimism of human technology in the 30s. It's very golden age. It's like reading science fiction from the 50s, right? It's very optimistic. It's very like, we're solving
Mm.
everything. We have antibiotics, we have radios, like,
Yeah.
we've kind of reached an apex of
1939.
modernity.
We've got it all figured out.
1939. Exactly. Exactly. It's the halcyon days.
Yeah. Wow. Um, yeah. And I mean, to your point too, like I feel like there is, whether consciously or not, like a talismanic property to creating a book like that with that kind of optimism is that you're going to make it so that 5,000
Exactly.
years from now we will still be here. Yeah.
Yes,
Like,
there's a clarity
yeah.
of intent and yeah,
Yeah.
an optimism that will still be here. And
Yeah. That's amazing. And I like that they even went to the trouble of diagramming how to pronounce words, because with the
Mhm.
lost languages that we're aware of now, we can never really be sure what it sounded like when it was spoken.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Um, yeah,
But five
it's
thousand
a
years from now, that would be helpful.
right. Exactly. And I always think sort of like the other side of the coin of that conversation is like those like symbiotic exercises that are done for like how do you demark where nuclear waste is buried so that in 5,000 years when everything is different people know not to dig in those areas, right? Like that's the other side of
Yeah.
that conversation of like how do you convey that there's danger when you cannot safely assume that anyone will be speaking English or understanding
Yeah.
symbols in the same way that we are. But you don't want them like digging up the 135 barrels of wasted your plutonium fuel or whatever.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I think they'd figure it out the hard way.
Yes, yeah, they're gonna learn quick.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been going for a bit now. I don't want to make this too long, but this has been like a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Were there any books that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, or
The only other one I was going to mention, and this is not a grimoire, but this is the William Gibson's Agrippa, the Book of the Dead. Are
okay,
you familiar with this? Um, I
William Gibson's book about Agrippa? Is that what you said?
well, it's called Agrippa, the Book of the Dead, and it
Okay.
was published on floppy disk.
All right.
and it could only be read once. And
Oh, and then it
after you
deleted itself.
and then it deletes
Yeah.
itself. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's from the 80s, and this is another one of these not exactly contemporary rare books, but I always think of it as sort of just kind of an interesting exercise in the book as temporary but magical object, and as artifact.
That yeah, I have heard of this actually, yeah, but I've never read it before. Um,
I don't think many people have read it.
no. But it sounds like it could just be a legend, you know.
Yes.
Because the only Gibson I ever read was I think Neuromancer.
Hmm.
Maybe a short story here or there, but yeah, that's that, even in the digital age we have these kinds of ideas about scarcity and
Hmm.
value and a certain kind of physicality where it's stored on a disk.
Yes.
So yeah, yeah, that's wild stuff. um all right, well, um what are you up to these days? Are you online anywhere where you'd like people to follow you and keep up with what you're doing? Or you mentioned Twitter earlier, which I'm no longer on, but I guess you're still sticking it out on there.
Yes, I will never log off. Yeah, so yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Leah Prime. I mostly post about everything from mountaineering and motorcycles to Dharma and mysticism and psychedelic experiences. Um, I am in the glacially slow but progressive process of writing a book titled We Own the Night: The History of Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM, which is basically an exploration of Art Bell in the 1990s radio show Coast to Coast AM, which is sort of a paranormal radio show,
Mhm.
both a general history and also sort of an exploration on how that show and how Art Bell influenced sort of our current conspiracy-driven media culture.
Mhm.
So I'm working on that. Um, and publishing, I do have a Substack, leahprime.substack.com, if people want to keep up on sort of like where I'm traveling, what I'm doing. Tends to be far reaching, everything from skiing and backpacking adventure to Wagner and the Rain to um, you know, anything I'm reading at a given time.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said earlier, you're full of surprises because I think we first interacted because of UFO Twitter,
Crazy UFO Twitter, yes.
and I was like, oh, she's a UFO person. But I'm like, oh, but also mystical, but also an explorer, also rare books. You're just full of surprises. Like every time I learn something new about you, I'm like, well, I didn't know that,
I,
but it tracks because she's
I've
just
I've
she's
been
got
very
many
lucky.
layers.
Yeah, I've been able to live a lot of lives. But AP, this was a pleasure. I'm delighted we had a chance to finally catch up, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I mean, it was great, and I think I'll have to have you on again. So, yeah, keep in touch.
For sure. All right, take care.